an engineer by education from IIT Delhi. I graduated in electrical, mechanical engineering, electronics and telecommunications. And that was a long time ago, that was in 1970. And I have worked, as Nava said earlier, I've worked in India, I've worked in Iran. In India, I was a project manager. I built an aircraft factory, MiG-21s, watch factory, a scooter factory, etc., for 4 years. Then in Iran, I was in the intelligence game. I was working for Rockwell Collins and Philco Ford, listening electronically into the Soviet Union along the Caspian Sea. Then I got transferred to Germany, where I worked in Kraftwerk Union where I learned automation of nuclear power plants. And finally to Australia in 1982, where I used to work for a company called Siemens. I've been with Siemens all through in this period. And that's where my first entrepreneurial experience started in 1982 in Australia. I think it was the time that IBM introduced their PC. And the PC was very deficient in design. I saw an opportunity. We established a business to sell memory chips, disk drives, and we hired a couple of people to manufacture cables for that. That was the first small business opportunity for us. I kept on working, my wife ran a business. And then we went to the United States, stayed there for about 8 to 10 years, came back to Australia, and upon my return to Australia, I was sent to Australia by a company called MCI to opportunistically avail of the changing telecommunications environment. And I started a telecom company called AAPT in Australia and Clear Communications in New Zealand. Those both were experiments. Our partners in this one in AAPT were, of course, AAP, the Australian Associated Press, along with News Corp. So that was big exposure. And after that, after having done that in 1995, I thought to myself, I was very young and naive at that time. I thought to myself that this is so bloody easy, we can do it ourselves. So I started Primus Telecom, along with the 3 other partners. 2 of them were in the United States, and the 4th one was in England, in the UK. So I was running the Australian operation, the guys were running the American operation from Washington, DC, and a friend was running it in the United Kingdom. We didn't have any money, so we started in the basement of my house. We're renting 6 telephone lines, not paying anything, and hoping everything would fall together. Fortunately, it did. That's another long story, and it eventually became a $1.2 billion company, which eventually went through a bankruptcy in 2009. Okay. And bankruptcy under Chapter 11 laws, which is totally different. This protection of business rather than destruction of business, as it happens in Australia. And in between, along the way, I have been involved in, besides PC Connection, the first one that I mentioned, probably heard the brand. I also became a founding director of a company called Virtual Communities Limited, which was owned by ACTU. I was the executive chairman, so I learned a lot there. And the partners in that were, frankly enough, James Becker and a few other people like that. So it was enormous. It's a very tough job. Now, looking at small business, right, okay, what does small business really need? I have not done any academic studies of small business, but I can tell you from my experience. I talked to Nava during our tea break, and we talked about what is a small business. I wanted a reference benchmark, and she said, well, we are looking at 20 employees. Yeah, sure, that's one way to look at it. But I thought probably, from my perspective as a practical business person, it is appropriate to look at revenue. Because revenue, every small businessman or a woman, so when I use a businessman, I really mean it's gender neutral word to me, right? See, I made a friend. So, where was I? Yeah. So what does it mean to me as a small business? And I actually established very recently, 1.5 years, another small business for my son. It's called Performance Brands, in which he does various things related to automobiles. So it dawned, I mean, what the experience is like this, that most small businessmen work in the business. Right? They have 2 or 3 employees, 5 employees. The smaller the number of employees you have, the less resilience you have to staff mobility. So this guy has 5 people, and if his head mechanic leaves, he's stuck. On the end, he has, because because of the economics of the business and because of the stage it is at, a small businessman really works in the business, works very long hours, okay, and has no access to professional advice because he can't afford it. But he faces the same challenges that he must grow the business to give it the financial resilience it needs. And without the advice, he cannot get that bloody resilience because he can't afford it. So it's a hell of a catch-22. How do we address that? I don't know. But I can only tell you the problems. I mean, we had the same problems looking back when we started PC Connection. We had no advice at all. We did everything ourselves. I planned a startup, no guidance, no advice. So learned on the job, learned everything about finance, balance sheet, stock market, Wall Street, raising money, listing on NASDAQ, etc., just on the job. If I look at VC, Virtual Communities Limited, right, okay, because of the heavyweight board, there was so much advice that we could never do anything. Because James Packer wanted to go this way, the other guy wanted to go this way, Lindsay wanted to go that way, so it was a disaster. Okay. So how you structure boards is also very important. And what else did I understand? There are cost pressures on small business and there are cash flow pressures. And cash flow pressures are killer in Australia because small businesses have very little access to funding to smoothen out the troughs and peaks in cash flow. Nobody will lend you money. Nobody, period. Okay. Competition is always a problem. I mentioned workload, which wrecks your family life. Okay. And I mean, a case in point is the Australian automobile ancillary industry. Right. I'm also on the Geelong Enterprise Board, and I've learned from them that the average headcount, the average size of car parts manufacturer is 10 people. Right. That's one. So if Ford is going out of business, half of these guys are going to be out of business. If they go out of business, Toyota goes out of business, etc. This is one side of the thing. The other side of it is you look at India. India makes 18 million vehicles of different type, out of which 4.5 million, I think, are cars. And they are actually built in 5 clusters around India, which is a good thing. And they are looking for people to come and set up ancillary plants. But Australia is not participating in it because the unit size is simply too small. And despite the best efforts of the state government, it is very, very hard to consolidate it. It's very hard to take people because they're so busy working on their business and trying to survive that they can't see, what's the phrase for it? Yeah, I mean, they can't see the forest for the trees. That I think is a popular expression. That's the challenge of small business faces. And migrant issues, right? I can explain to you migrant issues. I was the first Indian to be employed by a company called MCI in the United States. It was a $5 billion company with 20,000 employees. So I know how I felt. And when I came to Australia to work for Siemens, I was the first Indian to work for that company, which has 4,000 employees in Australia, which was great, but wonderful experience. You know, this thing about people not being able to relate to each other culturally is nonsense. Once people get to know each other, once they break bread together, once they work together for a few months, then I think all barriers disappear. Our color disappears. I mean, a name like Ravi, you can't get more Indian than that, right? So after working together, after really, you know, the bridges get built, and the race barriers, the ethnicity barriers, the diaspora barriers disappear. This has been my experience. This is the experience of my son who runs his own business. So when he bought this business in which there were 3 employees, the head mechanic was a guy called Nick Clark. He's still there. He would just stare at that. He was beyond, totally shocked that an Indian had bought his business, right? Okay. But he was being paid well, job market's not easy, so he stuck. Now they're the best of friends in a few months. So let's forget about the artificial ethnic values. They're there in the beginning, but they'll be overcome. I don't think they hold any great terror for anyone. Using of advisors, can't afford advisors, right? And now Richard talked about succession planning. In the ethnic communities, what you will find is, at that level, that people find very difficult to open up about their family business affairs. So you have to really generate, I think, trust and confidence for people to be totally open and frank with you as to what they're thinking, what their intentions are, what their long-term objectives are. And I think, I just heard that 1/3 of our GDP is contributed by small number. I mean, that is a stupendous number. I think of the opportunity of that. I'm not thinking of the threats. I'm thinking if we can make this more successful, how many points can we add to the GDP? I think quite a bit. So my request would be when you do studies, please do time and motion studies to see how we can give the small business operators some relief in terms of paperwork, bureaucracy, etc., etc. And I can tell you, the internet can play a wonderful role now in educating the small business. There is so much content out there, except that people don't know how to use it. The next generation does, the current doesn't. So we should start promoting that, and I think we can improve productivity, we can actually make businesses smarter, and so on. And I think that's all the notes I've written in the last few minutes.
Thank you.
And I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you.